Imagine a place where silence was the cruelest weapon, where the absence of violence became violence itself, where men feared not death, but the slow dissolution of everything they believed made life worth living. Cowra Prisoner of War Camp. Built in 1942 for £800,000, that's $12 million today, to house enemy soldiers as far from civilization as possible. 250 miles inland from Sydney, surrounded by 600 miles of nothing in every direction. The most efficiently designed prison system in the Pacific Theater. So successful that criminals across Australia whispered its name in courthouse corridors like a curse. But on August 5, 1944, this machine of perfect efficiency experienced the most spectacular failure in prisoner of war history. Over 1,000 Japanese prisoners launched a mass breakout that wasn't about escape, it was about death. 234 prisoners died in 30 minutes, most by gunfire, many by suicide. 4 Australian guards killed, the largest POW uprising of World War II. This wasn't rebellion, it was ritualized mass death. A final ceremony performed by men who had discovered that honor could only be restored through willing destruction. Today, we open the classified files on the prison that worked exactly as designed, and that's why it failed so catastrophically. We'll examine the blueprints, the psychological studies, the moment-by-moment breakdown of how efficiency became catastrophe, how wire and routine and bureaucratic boredom created the conditions for one of the war's most shocking demonstrations of the human spirit's refusal to be processed like cargo. Join me as we uncover the true story of the machine that taught the world that some cages can only be broken from the inside by breaking everything they were meant to contain. The criminals called it the quiet death, not the gallows, not the chair. Cowra, a name whispered in courthouse corridors and prison yards across Australia. They said if you ended up there, you didn't break. You simply dissolved, like salt in warm water. Slowly, completely, without ceremony. But Cowra wasn't built for criminals. It was built for enemies. And on August 5, 1944, those enemies taught the world something about the mathematics of despair, about what happens when you cage not just bodies, but beliefs, about the moment when death becomes preferable to waiting. This is the story of a machine. A prison designed with spreadsheets and blueprints, wire measurements and guard rotations. A system so efficient, so humane, so perfectly logical that it accidentally created one of the Second World War's most spectacular failures, where over 1,000 men chose to die rather than live another day in captivity, where silence became torture and routine became violence, and the most deadly weapon was time itself. The machine worked exactly as designed. That was the problem. 250 miles inland from Sydney, the train tracks cut through red dirt and endless sky. This is wheat country, sheep country, land that stretches to the horizon without a single hill to break the monotony. In 1942, this emptiness wasn't a liability. It was exactly what the planners ordered. The telegram arrived at Government House on a Tuesday morning. Britain needed prison capacity. Fast. Australia would provide it. The war was churning out captives faster than anyone had calculated, and the mathematics were simple. Every prisoner shipped to Australia was one less mouth to feed in bombed-out Britain, one less security risk near vital ports and factories. The Site Selection Committee spread maps across mahogany tables in Canberra. Red pins marked railway lines, blue pins marked existing infrastructure, green pins marked nothing, just empty space where problems could be stored and forgotten. Cowra earned its pin not because it was special, but because it was perfectly unremarkable. 17 miles from the nearest town, rail access via the main Western Line, flat ground for rapid construction, winter temperatures that dropped below freezing, summer heat that cracked the earth, no beaches, no ports, no strategic value whatsoever. The prisoners would be surrounded by 600 miles of nothing in every direction. Geography itself would be the first wall, the first guard, the first psychological weight pressing down on any man foolish enough to dream of escape. The land acquisition papers were signed without fanfare. Farmer McIntyre received compensation of 800 pounds for soil that had never grown anything but wheat and worry. The surveyor's chains marked out boundaries on ground that had known only sheep tracks and seasonal floods. By winter's end, Government Paddock 7 had become prisoner of war camp number 2104. Cowra. But the land remembered what it had been: clay soil that turned to sucking mud when the rains came, low-lying ground that collected morning fog like a bowl collects water, seasonal winds that carried sound for miles on clear nights. The earth itself would later become an unwitting accomplice to catastrophe. The construction tender went to Morrison and Company, builders of hospitals and schools, men who understood timber and deadlines but had never caged human beings. The blueprint was standard issue, copied from camps across 3 continents: perimeter fence, guard towers, administration block, prisoner barracks. Simple, functional, cheap. Time was everything. The war wouldn't wait for architectural perfection. Britain was losing merchant vessels faster than they could count, and every ship that survived the Atlantic crossing had to maximize its human cargo. The telegram marked urgent arrived weekly, more prisoners coming. Speed construction. The work gangs arrived before sunrise, 6 days a week, local men grateful for steady wages in a war economy that had consumed their sons and brothers. They hammered and sawed and poured concrete footings, while dust clouds marked their progress from miles away. No one asked what manner of men would live here. No one wondered about the psychology of captivity. They were building boxes for storage, not homes for human beings. Timber came by rail from Queensland forests, pine and hardwood cut to military specifications. Wire arrived in massive spools, hundreds of miles of galvanized steel that would soon form barriers and boundaries, and the physical mathematics of despair. Guard towers rose like exclamation points against the empty sky, octagonal structures that offered 360-degree visibility across terrain that offered nowhere to hide. The first structures were purely functional: administration building, guardhouse, ammunition storage. Beauty was irrelevant. Comfort was irrelevant. The only metric that mattered was capacity: how many bodies could be processed, housed, fed, and contained per dollar of construction cost. Efficiency was humanity in its most reduced form. By autumn of 1943, Cowra had acquired the skeletal framework of its destiny: 4 separate compounds surrounded by double fences of barbed wire. Each compound designed to house different categories of prisoner: officers separated from enlisted men, Japanese separated from Germans, work details separated from general population. Division was the fundamental principle. Unity was the fundamental fear. The guard towers commanded views across flat ground that stretched beyond the horizon. During the day, a man could be spotted from 2 miles away. At night, searchlights carved geometric patterns across the dirt, overlapping fields of vision that should have made escape impossible. Should have. The planners calculated sight lines and response times with mathematical precision. What they never calculated was the possibility that escape might not be the objective. Each compound contained rows of timber barracks, structures that housed 60 men per building in conditions that met every international standard for prisoner welfare: adequate ventilation, sufficient space per occupant, proper sanitation facilities. The Geneva Convention was scrupulously observed. There would be no beatings, no starvation, no torture. The system would destroy men through law-abiding boredom, regulation-compliant hopelessness, and bureaucratically approved despair. The kitchens could process 3 meals per day for 4,000 prisoners. The medical facility contained 12 beds and surgical equipment for emergency procedures. The recreation area included space for organized sports and approved entertainment. Every human need was anticipated, except the one that mattered most: the need for meaning, for purpose, for death before dishonor. As construction neared completion, the administrative staff arrived: camp commandant, security chief, medical officer, supply sergeant, men trained in the management of human inventory. They carried manuals that prescribed procedures for every conceivable situation except the inconceivable one. They understood regulations and quotas and paperwork, but they had never stared into the eyes of men who considered survival itself a form of moral failure. The final construction inspection occurred on a Tuesday morning in March. Government officials walked the perimeter, checked the sight lines, tested the locks, verified the capacity calculations. The camp was pronounced ready for operation. 4,000 men could be housed, fed, guarded, and contained indefinitely. The machine was complete, calibrated, and waiting for its raw material. What waited in the empty barracks was silence, not peace. Silence, the kind of quiet that accumulates weight, that presses against eardrums, that makes men count their own heartbeats for entertainment. The kind of silence that would soon be filled with whispers and planning, and the soft sound of improvised weapons being carved from baseball bats in the darkness before dawn. The first prisoners arrived on a cattle train that moved like a funeral procession across the inland plains. German U-boat crews captured in the Atlantic, Italian soldiers from the North African campaign, and then, in increasing numbers, the Japanese. Soldiers and sailors who had never expected to survive their first capture, who had been trained to die rather than submit, who found themselves trapped not just by wire and guards but by the impossible mathematics of their own existence. They came in groups of 50, shackled and silent, staring through barred windows at landscape that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. Many had never seen so much empty space. The ocean was vast, but it moved. This land simply waited, patient and eternal, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The processing station operated with assembly line efficiency. Names recorded, personal effects cataloged, medical examinations completed, compound assignments determined by nationality, rank, and security classification. Each man became a number in a ledger, a data point in a system designed to minimize costs per prisoner per day. The clerks filled out forms in triplicate while dust settled on everything like a slow-falling shroud. Compound D received the Japanese enlisted men, 243 individuals stripped of rank, unit designation, and the hierarchical structure that had given their lives meaning since childhood. In Japanese military culture, enlisted men were nothing without their officers to command them, their sergeants to guide them, their emperor to serve. The administrative decision to separate them by rank wasn't cruel, it was simply logical. And logic, applied without wisdom, became the camp's first weapon against the human spirit. The compound itself was a rectangle of dirt surrounded by double fences, guard towers at each corner. A single gate watched by armed sentries 24 hours per day. Inside the wire, 10 timber barracks, a mess hall, a recreation area, and latrines that stank of disinfectant and resignation. The prisoners were informed of the rules: when to wake, when to eat, when to sleep. Compliance was expected, cooperation was encouraged, resistance was pointless. What the guards couldn't see was the invisible weight settling onto men's shoulders, the shame of being alive when honor demanded death, the humiliation of eating food provided by enemies. The grinding psychological erosion of days that began and ended exactly the same way, without purpose or progress or any hope of redemption through action. The guards themselves were local men, farmers and shopkeepers called to service, armed with rifles and good intentions, but no understanding of the cultural mathematics that governed their prisoners' souls. They had been told that Japanese soldiers were naturally disciplined, naturally obedient, naturally resigned to their fate. None of them had been trained to recognize the difference between compliance and preparation. During the first months, Compound D operated exactly as designed. The prisoners woke to bugles, ate rations that met nutritional requirements, participated in approved recreational activities, and returned to their barracks when darkness fell. Medical reports noted excellent health. Disciplinary reports noted minimal incidents. Supply reports noted efficient resource utilization. Every metric suggested success. But success was measured in absence. Absence of violence, absence of escape attempts, absence of overt resistance. No one measured the accumulation of shame, the slow strangulation of meaning, the way silence could become a form of torture more effective than any physical brutality. No one counted the cost of stripping men of purpose and offering them survival as compensation. The prisoners began to modify their environment in small ways. Baseball bats appeared in the recreation area, approved equipment for approved activities. Blankets were rewoven to increase thickness and durability. Wooden fixtures in the barracks were carved and shaped during long afternoons when work details had been completed and night was still hours away. The guards observed these activities and noted them in reports as positive signs of adaptation and morale. They were witnessing weapon manufacturing. The separation order arrived on a Thursday morning in July. Administrative efficiency demanded that enlisted men be transferred to a different facility to make room for officer prisoners, who required different security protocols. The transfer would occur in phases, beginning August 15th. Standard procedure, routine paperwork, one more logical decision in a system built entirely of logical decisions. But logic intersected with something the planners had never calculated. The Japanese concept of collective identity, the belief that individual existence meant nothing without the group to give it structure and meaning. The separation order wasn't perceived as administrative reshuffling, it was understood as the final dissolution of everything that remained of their military identity. It was death by bureaucracy. That night, in Barracks 7, Warrant Officer Mori gathered the senior enlisted men. They spoke in whispers that wouldn't carry to the guard posts, using words that had been forbidden since their capture. They spoke of duty, of honor, of death as liberation from shame. They spoke of August 5th, 10 days before the scheduled separation, time enough to prepare, time enough to gather tools and weapons and courage. What they planned wasn't escape. Escape was selfish, individual, ultimately meaningless. What they planned was a group death that would restore honor through action, that would prove they had remained soldiers even in captivity, that would demonstrate the futility of trying to contain beliefs with wire and guards and regulations. The machine hummed with quiet efficiency, counting days and processing paperwork and measuring rations with mathematical precision. The guards walked their rounds and checked their weapons and filed their reports. The administration processed requisitions and updated prisoner counts and planned for the logistical challenges of the upcoming transfer. No one noticed that the silence in Compound D had acquired a different quality. No longer the silence of resignation, but the silence of preparation. The kind of quiet that precedes thunder, when the air itself seems to hold its breath, when even the dust motes hang motionless in anticipation of the storm to come. The machine was working perfectly, every gear turning smoothly, every procedure functioning as designed, every regulation being observed with scrupulous care. The system had succeeded in containing bodies, processing paperwork, and maintaining order. What it couldn't contain was the idea that death might be preferable to efficiency, that honor might matter more than survival, that men could choose meaning over existence, could select catastrophe over compliance, could transform a logical prison into the stage for an illogical tragedy that would echo across decades. The calendar turned to August. The countdown began, and in the timber barracks of Compound D, 243 men prepared to teach their captors that some cages can only be broken from the inside, by breaking the spirits of those they were meant to contain. The clock owned them now. Not the guards, not the wire, not the endless horizon. The clock. 6 in the morning. Revel. 7:30, morning meal. 8:15, work details. 1,200 hours, midday rations. 1,800 hours, evening mess. 2,100 hours, lights out. The same mathematical progression every day, every week, every month until time itself became a form of imprisonment, more absolute than any physical barrier. In the guard towers, men with binoculars swept the same arcs of vision hour after hour, watching for movement that never came, scanning for threats that never materialized. The prisoners had settled into routines so predictable they could be timed with chronometers. Morning calisthenics in the recreation area, afternoon repairs to barracks equipment, evening conversations that died with the sunset, compliance so complete it approached performance art. But routine was a blade that cut both ways. The guards had learned to anticipate prisoner behavior with such precision that they stopped truly seeing it. Movement became expected, schedules became invisible, and the difference between order and preparation dissolved into the comfortable blur of institutional life. The wire itself told the story of the system's confidence. Double perimeter fencing, yes, but not electrified. The cost-benefit analysis had determined that geography and guard towers provided sufficient deterrent. The outer fence stood 8 feet high, topped with coils of barbed wire that gleamed like steel roses in the morning sun. The inner fence matched it exactly, creating a no-man's land 12 feet wide where nothing grew except weeds and the occasional wildflower that had somehow found purchase in the alkaline soil. Between the compounds, the wire continued its geometric progression, dividing space into controllable segments. Compound A for German officers, Compound B for Italian enlisted men, Compound C for German non-commissioned ranks, and Compound D, the rectangle of dirt and timber where 243 Japanese enlisted men had learned to measure their lives in 6-hour intervals. The guard towers commanded the geometry of containment like lighthouse keepers tending beacons of control. Tower 1 covered the main gate and the administration building. Tower 2 watched the eastern perimeter and the approach from the railway line. Tower 3 monitored the northwestern corner where the wire met the vehicle maintenance area. Tower 4 observed the western boundary and the road that connected the camp to the outside world, a world that might as well have existed on another planet. At night, the towers became islands of light in an ocean of darkness. Searchlights carved overlapping circles across the compound grounds. Mechanical eyes that never blinked, never tired, never questioned the assumption that light equaled security. The guards trusted their technology, trusted their sightlines, trusted the mathematical certainty that 4 towers could observe everything that mattered within the wire. They couldn't observe what was happening inside the prisoners' minds. The smell of the place settled into everything. Timber, preservative and disinfectant, boiled vegetables and unwashed wool, dust and sweat, and the peculiar metallic odor that accumulated wherever large numbers of men lived in close proximity. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was inescapable. The smell of efficiency. The smell of human beings processed like inventory, housed like cargo, maintained like machinery. In Compound D, the barracks had acquired their own aromatic signature, green lumber still weeping sap, blankets that held the morning chill long into the afternoon, and something else. The smell of sharpened steel hidden beneath mattresses, of wooden implements carved into weapons during the long hours between evening mess and lights out. The guards attributed the metallic smell to the iron fixtures and galvanized roofing. They were breathing evidence of their own eventual destruction. The daily work details provided the only variation in the mechanical progression of time. Prisoners were assigned to camp maintenance, repairing fences, cleaning administration buildings, maintaining the vehicle pool. The work was real but meaningless, designed more to occupy hands and minds than to accomplish any strategic objective. Men who had piloted fighter aircraft repaired bicycle chains. Marines who had stormed beaches swept administrative offices. For the Japanese prisoners, the work represented another layer of humiliation. Labor without honor, effort without purpose, survival through cooperation with enemies who had stripped them of everything that defined their existence. Each task completed was another small death, another compromise with the reality that their training and culture had taught them to reject completely. But the work details also provided opportunity. Access to tools, however briefly supervised. Familiarity with camp routines and guard schedules. Knowledge of weak points in the perimeter, blind spots in the tower coverage, moments when attention shifted elsewhere. Information that accumulated like sediment, building toward something the guards couldn't imagine and the administrators couldn't measure. The baseball equipment had arrived in June. Bats, balls, gloves donated by Australian civilian organizations eager to demonstrate humanitarian concern for enemy prisoners. The Geneva Convention encouraged recreational activities, and baseball was considered particularly appropriate. Organized, rule-based, physically demanding but not aggressive. The perfect metaphor for controlled competition within acceptable boundaries. The prisoners had embraced baseball with enthusiasm that surprised the guards. Teams formed along barrack lines. tournaments organized, games scheduled for late afternoon when work details were complete and evening mess was still hours away. The crack of bat against ball became a regular soundtrack to camp life, punctuating the silence with sounds of normal human activity. No one noticed that the bats were being modified. Handles wrapped with strips of cloth for better grip. Hitting surfaces sanded to remove manufacturers' markings and create rough wood that would hold blood and tissue more effectively. Weight distribution altered by carving away wood in strategic locations, creating weapons that looked like sporting equipment but functioned like clubs designed for human skulls. The blankets, too, were being transformed. Standard military issue, woolen cotton weaves designed for durability and warmth. The prisoners had begun unraveling and reweaving them, testing different patterns and thicknesses, determining which configurations would best absorb rifle bullets and which would provide the most protection against a machine gun fire. The guards observed this activity and noted it in their daily reports as positive adaptation. Prisoners taking initiative to improve their living conditions, demonstrating investment in their environment, showing signs of long-term psychological adjustment to captivity. The psychological profiles suggested men who had accepted their situation and were making the best of it. They were documenting evidence of mass suicide preparation. The evening conversations had acquired a different quality as summer progressed toward August. Groups gathered in the recreation area after evening mess, speaking in voices too low to carry to the guard posts, using words and phrases that wouldn't have meant anything to English-speaking ears, but carried profound significance for men raised in Bushido tradition. They spoke of cherry blossoms, brief, beautiful, falling at the moment of perfect bloom. They spoke of the chrysanthemum and the sword, beauty and death intertwined as the highest expression of honor. These weren't escape plans being discussed in careful whispers. These were death plans, choreographed, coordinated, designed not for survival, but for meaning. The conversations followed ancient patterns of ritual preparation, acknowledgments of fear transformed into acceptance, individual terror sublimated into collective purpose. Warrant Officer Mori had emerged as the unofficial leader of these discussions, not through rank, which had been stripped from all of them, but through moral authority earned in combat and sustained through captivity. He spoke of the transfer order as the final insult, the administrative decision that would dissolve even the pretense of military identity. After August 15th, they would be nothing more than inventory to be moved, numbers to be processed, problems to be solved through bureaucratic efficiency. The younger prisoners listened with expressions that mixed terror and relief. They had lived with shame for months, eating enemy food, accepting enemy shelter, surviving when honor demanded death. The transfer order provided what they had been seeking without knowing it: justification for action, excuse for violence, reason to transform compliance into catastrophe. The older men, veterans of campaigns in China and the Pacific, understood the mathematics of what was being proposed. They would die, all of them. The guards had rifles, machine guns, searchlights, radio communication with military units in surrounding towns. There would be no escape, no survival, no return to Japan to tell the story. But there would be honor. There would be proof that captivity had not broken their spirits, that efficiency could not contain their souls, that death was preferable to the slow dissolution of everything they had been taught to value. The modifications to camp equipment accelerated as August approached. Kitchen knives disappeared from the mess hall, not stolen, but borrowed overnight, and returned before morning inspection with edges honed to surgical sharpness. Bed frames were quietly disassembled, wooden supports carved into spear points, metal fixtures bent into hooks and blades. The camp's own infrastructure was being cannibalized to create the instruments of its destruction. The guards noticed none of this because they were measuring the wrong variables. Head counts were accurate. Work details proceeded on schedule. Disciplinary incidents remained at zero. Medical reports indicated excellent prisoner health. Food consumption stayed within normal parameters. Every metric that mattered to the administrative system suggested a camp functioning exactly as designed. But behind the numbers, psychological pressure was building toward critical mass. Men who had lived for months in a state of suspended shame were approaching the point where action, any action, became preferable to continued existence. The transfer order had provided deadline and justification. The modifications to equipment had provided means. All that remained was opportunity. The night watches had settled into predictable patterns. Guards walked perimeter rounds every 2 hours, checking locks, testing searchlight functionality, verifying radio communication with the other towers. Between rounds they stayed in the tower structures, protected from wind and insects, observing the compounds through binoculars that worked well during the day but provided limited visibility in darkness. The searchlights created patterns of illumination that looked comprehensive but left significant blind spots. Areas where the beams overlapped poorly, shadows cast by barrack buildings, dead zones near the inner fence where tower angles created geometric gaps in coverage. The prisoners had mapped these shadows during their recreational activities, noting which areas remained dark during searchlight sweeps, calculating distances and timing. The camp's isolation, originally designed as its greatest security asset, had become a potential liability. The nearest military installation was 40 miles away. Local police were undermanned and lightly armed. Radio communication was reliable, but help was hours away even under ideal conditions. The system had been designed to contain prisoners, not to repel a mass assault by men who expected to die in the attempt. The ammunition storage followed standard protocols, adequate supplies for extended engagement, but not unlimited. The guards carried 15 rounds each, with additional clips stored in the towers. Machine gun ammunition was rationed according to peacetime training standards, sufficient for normal security operations, but potentially inadequate for sustained combat against large numbers of attackers who felt no need to seek cover or preserve their own lives. As July surrendered to August, the mechanical precision of camp operations began to feel less like efficiency and more like the ticking of a bomb. Every routine was followed exactly, every regulation observed completely, every procedure executed with perfect compliance. The system was working so well that no one noticed it had become a countdown mechanism, marking time toward a moment when order would explode into chaos, when compliance would become carnage, when the most successful prisoner of war camp in the Pacific Theater would learn that some forms of control are indistinguishable from provocation. The prisoners had stopped looking toward the wire as a barrier. They had begun seeing it as a starting line. The morning of August 4th arrived with unusual clarity. No fog hugged the ground. No dust clouds obscured the horizon. The sky stretched overhead like blue metal, hard and bright and somehow expectant. In the guard towers, men squinted against sunlight that seemed more intense than usual, unaware they were experiencing the peculiar atmospheric conditions that precede catastrophe, the way air pressure changes before storms, the way silence deepens before thunder. The daily routine proceeded with mechanical precision. Réveillé at 600 hours, morning roll call, breakfast of porridge, bread, and tea that tasted like boiled leaves and institutional resignation. Work details assembled and marched to their assignments: fence repair, building maintenance, kitchen duty. The guards noted nothing unusual in their logbooks. Compliance remained absolute. Order persisted. But in Compound D, something had shifted. Not in behavior. The prisoners continued to follow every regulation, complete every assigned task, respond to every command with appropriate deference. The change was subtler, more fundamental. They moved like men who had made peace with death, who had resolved the psychological tension between survival and honor in favor of honor. Their faces had acquired the serene expression of terminal patients who have stopped fighting the inevitable. Warrant Officer Maury spent the morning hours in quiet conversation with the senior enlisted men, speaking in voices that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate circle. They weren't discussing tactics anymore. Those decisions had been made weeks ago. They were performing the ritual preparations that Japanese culture demanded before honorable death. Acknowledgement of family obligations that would remain unfulfilled. Expression of gratitude to parents and teachers. Acceptance of fear transformed through will into purpose. The younger prisoners gathered in separate groups. some barely out of adolescence. Boys who had been trained for war but not prepared for the psychological complexity of captivity. They listened to their elders with expressions that mixed terror and relief. Many had not slept for days, sustained by nervous energy and the approaching promise of action. They had lived for months in a state of suspended existence, and the countdown toward resolution, even resolution through death, had lifted a weight from their spirits that they hadn't realized they were carrying. The afternoon work details proceeded normally. Prisoners repaired sections of inner fence damaged by recent storms, replaced rotted timber in the barracks foundations, cleaned administrative buildings with the careful attention to detail that characterized all their activities. The guards supervised these tasks with practiced efficiency, noting the quality of work, the cooperation of prisoners, the absence of any behavioral irregularities that might suggest security concerns. They were watching men prepare the infrastructure for their own destruction. The fence repairs included strategic weakening of support posts. The foundation work created access to tools that would disappear into hidden caches. The cleaning duties provided final reconnaissance of guard positions, weapon storage, and communication equipment. The baseball game that afternoon drew an unusually large crowd. Nearly every prisoner in Compound D gathered around the makeshift diamond, cheering for plays with enthusiasm that seemed genuine but carried undertones the guards couldn't interpret. They were watching the final performance of normal life, the last hours of pretending that survival was acceptable, that compliance was bearable, that tomorrow would bring another day identical to today. The modified bats cracked against balls with sounds that echoed across the compound like practice sessions for human skulls. The games continued until shadows grew long and evening mess approached. The prisoners collected their equipment with unusual care, handling each bat and ball as if these objects possessed ceremonial significance, which, for the next 12 hours, they would. Evening mess proceeded according to schedule. Rice, vegetables, soup that tasted like dishwater flavored with institutional despair. The prisoners ate with appetites that surprised the kitchen staff, men consuming final meals with the focus of athletes before competition. Conversations remained muted, but body language suggested anticipation rather than resignation. The guards attributed this mood change to improved morale, evidence that the recreational activities and regular work routine were producing positive psychological effects. They were observing the final gathering of men who had chosen death over continued shame. The sun set behind guard towers that cast long shadows across compound ground still warm from the day's heat. Searchlights flickered on according to schedule, carving geometric patterns across dirt that would soon be churned with blood. Radio communications verified normal status with all tower positions. Ammunition counts confirmed adequate supplies for routine security operations. Everything functioned exactly as designed. In the barracks of Compound D, men who would be dead within 6 hours performed the small rituals that precede sleep in institutional settings. Clothes folded, personal items arranged, blankets spread over mattresses that would soon be empty. But these weren't preparations for rest. They were ceremonies of departure, final arrangements made by men who expected to wake in death rather than dawn. The weapons cache had grown throughout the summer months. Baseball bats carved into clubs, kitchen knives sharpened to surgical edges, bed frame components fashioned into spears, blankets rewoven into shields that might absorb 1 or 2 rifle rounds before failing. The arsenal of desperate men who understood that victory was impossible, but defeat could still be honorable. At 2100 hours, lights went out across the camp. Generators shut down according to schedule, leaving only the tower searchlights and emergency illumination in the administrative areas. The guards settled into their night routine, perimeter walks every 2 hours, radio checks every 30 minutes, vigilance that had become mechanical through months of peaceful repetition. In the darkness of Compound D, 243 men lay on their mattresses and listened to their own heartbeats. Some prayed to ancestors who had died with honor. Others composed mental letters to families they would never see again. Many simply waited, counting respirations, measuring the distance between this moment and the moment when waiting would end forever. Mori moved through the barracks like a general inspecting troops before battle, except these troops expected no victory, no survival, no return to anything resembling normal life. They expected to die. They intended to die. They had planned to die in ways that would demonstrate the futility of trying to contain honor with wire and guards and bureaucratic efficiency. The signal would come at 0150 hours, 10 minutes before the next scheduled guard round, maximum time for action before tower response, optimal darkness for initial movement. The plan was simple because complexity would fail under stress, rush the gate simultaneously from multiple points, overwhelm the guards through numbers and surprise, breach the wire through mass rather than stealth. No one expected to escape. No one planned to survive. The objective was demonstration, proof that captivity had not broken their spirits, that honor could still triumph over survival instinct, that death was preferable to the slow dissolution of everything they had been taught to value. The younger prisoners struggled with fears that had nothing to do with death. They feared failure, cowardice, hesitation at the crucial moment. They feared that pain might overwhelm purpose, that survival instinct might prove stronger than moral obligation, that they might discover themselves to be less than the warriors they had been trained to become. The older men understood that fear was irrelevant. Fear was a luxury for those who had choices. They had reduced their existence to a single binary decision: die with honor tonight or continue living with shame indefinitely. The mathematics were simple. The answer was obvious. Outside the wire, the Australian countryside stretched toward horizons that would witness dawn in less than 5 hours. Sheep grazed in paddocks that had never known violence. Wheat swayed in fields that had never been irrigated with human blood. The land waited, patient and eternal, unaware that it was about to become the stage for one of the Second World War's most spectacular demonstrations of the difference between containment and control. The guards in their towers scanned the same arcs of vision they had monitored for months, watching for movement that never came, prepared for threats that never materialized. Their vigilance had become routine, their attention dulled by the comfortable predictability of institutional life. They were professional, competent, properly trained for every conceivable security challenge except the inconceivable one approaching with the inexorable momentum of destiny. At 0140 hours, the compound fell into a silence different from sleep. Not the quiet of rest, but the stillness that precedes thunder. Men who had been breathing normally began to control their respirations with conscious effort. Hearts that had been beating steadily began to accelerate with anticipation. Bodies that had been relaxed began to tense with purpose. The countdown had reached its final minutes. The machine that had operated with perfect efficiency for over a year was about to discover that some forms of human cargo cannot be contained indefinitely, that honor can override survival instinct, that the most successful prison systems can still fail when they attempt to cage beliefs rather than bodies. In 10 minutes, the quiet death would become the screaming chaos. The wire would run red, the towers would blaze with muzzle flashes, and Cowra would learn that efficiency is no defense against men who have chosen meaning over existence, who have selected death over compliance, who understand that some cages can only be broken by breaking everything inside them. The clock marked 0145, 5 minutes remaining. In the darkness of Compound D, 243 men prepared to transform their prison into their funeral pyre, their captivity into their final act of rebellion, their shame into something resembling honor. Time itself had become their enemy, and they were about to declare war on time. The moment arrived like the snap of a bowstring, 0150 hours precisely. No ceremony, no final speech, no dramatic countdown. Just the sudden movement of men who had been lying still as corpses and were now flowing like deadly water toward the compound gates. The bugle call shattered the night, not reveille, but the ancient Japanese battle cry that had echoed across Manchurian fields and Pacific islands where honor had mattered more than survival. The sound cut through darkness like a blade through silk, sharp and clean and utterly unexpected. In the guard towers, men jerked awake from the stupor of routine vigilance to find their world exploding into chaos. Movement erupted from every barracks simultaneously, not the panicked scrambling of riot or rebellion, but the coordinated flow of men executing a plan rehearsed in whispered conversations and measured glances. They moved with the fluid precision of water finding cracks in a dam, pouring through doorways and flowing across compound ground toward objectives mapped and memorized during months of apparent compliance. The first guard to die never understood what was happening. Private Morrison, 23 years old, walking his scheduled perimeter round with a rifle he had never fired at human beings, saw shapes materializing from shadow and darkness like manifestations of nightmare. He opened his mouth to shout a warning and discovered a sharpened kitchen knife sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. He fell without making a sound, his rifle clattering against concrete as his blood began the irrigation that would turn compound dust into mud. The main gate became a focal point of controlled violence. 20 men with modified baseball bats and improvised spears struck the lock mechanism and guard post with coordinated fury. The gate itself, designed to keep prisoners in, not attackers out, buckled under assault from men who understood that death was the only acceptable outcome. Metal screamed against metal as hinges designed for normal operation failed under abnormal stress. Guard Tower 2 erupted in muzzle flashes as Corporal Jenkins opened fire into the mass of moving bodies below. His rifle shots cracked across the compound like whips, each flash illuminating faces that showed no fear, no hesitation, no recognition that bullets were supposed to inspire retreat. The prisoners charged toward his position with blanket shields held high, absorbing rounds that should have stopped them, continuing forward with the inexorable momentum of men who had already made peace with death. Jenkins emptied his 15-round magazine into the approaching mass and reached for his spare ammunition to discover that 15 rounds meant nothing against men who expected to die. His hands shook as he reloaded, muscle memory from training sessions where targets had been paper silhouettes that fell when hit, not human beings who continued advancing with bullets in their bodies and honor in their hearts. The searchlight swung wildly as tower operators struggled to track movement that defied every tactical assumption they had been trained to expect. The lights created moving pools of brilliance that revealed scenes of controlled insanity. Prisoners rushing machine gun positions with wooden shields, men climbing wire fences while blood streamed from bullet wounds, bodies falling and being immediately replaced by others who stepped over the dead without pause or acknowledgement. The wire itself became a character in the unfolding tragedy. Double fences designed to channel and control movement were being breached by men who understood that flesh was expendable and freedom was irrelevant. They threw themselves against barbed wire with naked hands, accepting lacerations as the price of access, using their own bodies to create gaps through which others could pour. The wire drank blood like soil drinks rain, eagerly and without discrimination. From Guard Tower 4, Sergeant Williams activated the emergency communication system that would summon help from distant military installations. His voice cracked with disbelief as he described scenes that violated every assumption about prisoner behavior. They're not trying to escape, they're attacking, they're dying on purpose. The radio operator in town struggled to understand reports that made no tactical sense. Requests for assistance against an enemy that sought death rather than victory. The machine gun in Tower 3 began its mechanical conversation with human flesh. Corporal Adams had trained on the weapon for months, practiced on silhouettes and learned the mathematics of sustained fire, suppressing effects, and ammunition conservation. None of his training had prepared him for shooting at men who charged directly into his line of fire, who used their own dead as stepping stones, who transformed his position from hunter to hunted through the simple expedient of not caring whether they lived or died. The ammunition belt fed through the weapon with clockwork precision, each round finding target in bodies that should have sought cover, but instead pressed forward with suicidal determination. The barrel began to overheat from sustained fire, metal expanding beyond design tolerances as it attempted to stop men who had moved beyond the reach of bullets through the simple mechanism of accepting death as preferable to continued existence. In the administrative area, Duty Officer Captain Reynolds struggled to understand radio reports that seemed to describe impossible events. Prisoners were attacking outward rather than escaping inward. They were dying in place rather than seeking survival routes. They were using weapons that shouldn't exist against guards who had never expected to fight for their lives against men who had already surrendered theirs. The telephone lines to district headquarters carried conversations that would later read like fantasy in official reports. Send everything. Machine guns, artillery if you have it. We're under attack by our own prisoners. The duty staff in Brisbane struggled to parse requests that seemed to violate basic assumptions about human behavior under stress. The compound gates were breached through methods that would have impressed military engineers. Prisoners had used modified tools to create precise structural failures, attacking hinges and lock mechanisms with surgical accuracy developed through months of observation and planning. The barriers that had contained them for over a year collapsed in minutes under assault from men who understood that destruction was more achievable than construction. Beyond the wire, the breakout continued with the relentless momentum of floodwater finding its level. Hundreds of men poured through gaps created by their own sacrifice, flowing into Australian countryside that had never witnessed organized violence. They moved not with the desperate urgency of escapees, but with the measured pace of men conducting a ceremony, a ritual exodus that required completion regardless of consequence. The guard towers blazed with gunfire as defenders discovered the difference between security operations and combat operations. Their ammunition was adequate for normal situations, insufficient for abnormal ones. Their positions were designed to observe and control, not to repel coordinated assault. Their training had prepared them to manage prisoners, not to fight soldiers who had redefined victory as death with honor. Private Jackson in Tower 1 emptied magazine after magazine into masses of moving bodies that seemed to absorb bullets without effect. Each muzzle flash illuminated faces that showed neither pain nor fear, only the serene expression of men who had resolved the fundamental tension between survival and meaning in favor of meaning. His hands developed an automatic rhythm: reload, aim, fire, reload, while his mind struggled to process scenes that violated every assumption about human behavior under fire. The camp's isolation, originally its greatest security asset, had become a liability that multiplied with each passing minute. Help was hours away. Radio communication was limited. The guards were discovering that their carefully calculated ratios of personnel to prisoners had been based on the assumption that prisoners wanted to live, that pain was a deterrent, that death was something to be avoided rather than embraced. The bloodletting continued with mechanical precision. Bodies accumulated like cordwood in areas where machine gun fields of fire overlapped, where prisoners had charged positions they knew to be defended, where death was the objective rather than an unfortunate side effect. The wire ran red with irrigation that would nourish nothing, that would only mark the spot where efficiency had encountered honor and been found wanting. The ammunition began to run low in Tower 3. Corporal Adams discovered that sustained combat consumed resources at rates that peacetime planners had never calculated. The machine gun that had seemed so formidable in training exercises was approaching the limits of its ammunition supply, while prisoners continued to flow through gaps created by their own sacrifice. He found himself counting rounds, rationing death, calculating the mathematics of terminal violence. The camp's carefully maintained records would later show that the breakout had lasted less than 30 minutes from first movement to final gunshot. 30 minutes to transform the most efficiently operated prisoner-of-war facility in the Pacific Theater into a killing field that would haunt everyone who survived it. 30 minutes to prove that some forms of human cargo cannot be contained indefinitely, that honor can override survival instinct, that death can be chosen as readily as life. The Australian countryside absorbed the violence with the patience of land that had witnessed drought and flood, fire and plague, but never organized human self-destruction. The earth drank blood that had been spilled not in anger but in ceremony, not for victory but for meaning, not for escape but for the kind of honor that could only be achieved through willing death. When the gunfire finally stopped, when the last prisoners had fallen or dispersed into darkness, when the towers stood silent over compound ground churned with mud made from dust and blood, the machine had learned something about the difference between containing bodies and controlling souls. It had discovered that efficiency was no defense against men who had chosen meaning over existence, that regulations were meaningless against adversaries who had moved beyond the reach of consequences through the simple expedient of embracing the ultimate consequence. The count would take hours. 234 Japanese prisoners dead, 4 Australian guards killed. Hundreds escaped into countryside where they would die of exposure, gunshot wounds, or suicide before dawn found them. The most successful prisoner of war camp in the Pacific Theater had become the site of one of the war's most spectacular demonstrations of the difference between captivity and control. The machine continued to operate. Generators hummed. Searchlights carved patterns across ground that would never again seem secure. Radio systems carried reports to authorities who would spend years trying to understand how efficiency had been transformed into catastrophe, how compliance had become carnage, how the most carefully regulated prison system in the war had been destroyed by men who had discovered that death was the one freedom that could never be taken from them. The wire remained. The towers stood. The barracks would be rebuilt, but the machine would never again assume that human beings could be processed like inventory, stored like cargo, managed through mathematics. It had learned that some forms of resistance cannot be contained by any physical barrier, that honor can be more powerful than survival instinct, that the most dangerous prisoners are those who have nothing left to lose except shame. In the growing light of dawn, Cowra would count its dead and discover that efficiency was no match for men who had transformed their captivity into their final victory, their prison into their monument, their shame into something that approached honor through the simple expedient of choosing death over continued compliance with a system that had never understood what it was really trying to contain.